We talked in lecture 2 in particular about the idea that patriarchy has its origins in male control of female sexuality. If that is right, then it would seem that an absolutely key goal for feminism would be women's control of their own sexuality, read here as reproduction in particular. Hence the familiar idea that abortion is a feminist issue. The abortion debate is one of the most polarized that exists. So-called pro-choicers say that a woman has the right to control her own body, and that includes the right to decide whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term. So-called pro-lifers say that a fetus has the right to life, and see abortion as one of the greatest crimes against humanity that has ever existed, in terms of its sheer scale, making women as a group some of the worst perpetrators of crimes against humanity in history. There were nearly 1 million abortions in 2020 in the United States alone. Disagreement over abortion correlates with left-right affiliation, but what it really tracks is religious, non-religious belief. And that makes sense, for the disagreement is really then one about metaphysics, not one about abortion per se. If there are such things as souls, it makes sense to think of new souls as entering the world at conception, and so to think of conception as the point from which there is another human with a right to life that then conflicts with whatever right the pregnant woman has to control her own body. On the other hand, if there are not such things as souls, then it's an open question what the point in development from conception on is such that there is such a rights conflict. One intriguing line of argument seeks to avoid the abortion issue by addressing the issue at the point of sex rather than the point of pregnancy. Erika Bachiochi writes in her 2021 book, The Rights of Women, about what was historically known as voluntary motherhood, the commitment of a couple to abstain from sex for periods of time in order to control pregnancy. And it is definitely worth flagging this option that we can change our sexual practices, for example, to have much less intercourse and instead either have less sexual activity altogether or to engage in alternative ways of giving and getting pleasure as a way of reducing or eliminating the risk of unwanted pregnancy and therefore reducing or eliminating any need for abortion. That is a solution that both gives women the right to control their own bodies and avoids having to conclude that one person's rights trump the others when we think there are two persons there. Putting the solution at sex would also be an interesting test of men's commitment to the pro-life position. If they can save lives, as they see it, by giving up sex, will they do it? We'll talk much more about heterosexual sex in lecture 7. For now, we can just note that a possible benefit to changing our sexual practices might be fewer abortions, even if that only means reduced distress about abortions in those who feel strongly against them. What I'm going to focus on in this lecture is pregnancy itself, from a few different angles that might hopefully open up some new ways of thinking about the permissibility or otherwise of abortion, at least for some viewers. In part 1, we'll start with one of the classic papers in moral philosophy on the topic of abortion, which grants for the sake of argument that when there is a pregnancy, there are two persons there, and offers some thought experiments for thinking about their competing interests. Then in parts 2 and 3, we'll move from the moral to the metaphysical, thinking more carefully in part 2 about when the person begins, at least in a secular worldview in which there are no souls. And in part 3, thinking about what the relation is between the pregnant woman and the fetus. Are there two individuals where one merely resides inside the other, or is there one individual for all or at least most of a pregnancy? And what implications does that have for the permissibility of abortion? Okay, part 1, competing interests of persons. In her famous 1971 paper, A Defense of Abortion, Judith Jarvis Thomson took up the question of what she framed as the competing rights of the pregnant woman and her fetus. She pointed out that opponents of abortion at the time seemed to spend most of their energies establishing that the fetus is a person. and not much time explaining the step from the fetus being a person to abortions being impermissible. She supposed that the argument must go something like this. Every person has a right to life, so the fetus has a right to life. No doubt, the mother has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed, and abortion may not be performed. Thomson challenges this argument on a number of grounds. She starts with what she calls the extreme view that no abortion for any reason is permissible. She notes that it can happen that abortions are required to save the mother's life. In such a case, the right to life of both persons is at stake, and it is not then clear whose is stronger. Presumably, they are equal. Perhaps we should flip a coin to decide who lives, Thomson suggests. Or perhaps we should add the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, together with her right to life, giving her overall the stronger claim. To demonstrate this point, she presents a thought experiment involving a tiny house with a rapidly growing child. I mean, a very tiny house and a rapidly growing child. You are already up against the wall of the house, and in a few minutes you'll be crushed to death. If the child is left alone, he'll simply burst open the house and walk out a free man. Thomson says that in this case, a third party could say they can't choose between the two lives in deciding how or whether to intervene. But you would have a right to self-defense, and so could attack this rapidly growing child. She writes, however innocent the child may be, you do not have to wait passively while it crushes you to death. And then she says, perhaps a pregnant woman is vaguely felt to have the status of a house, to which we don't allow the right of self-defense. But if the woman houses the child, it should be remembered that she is a person who houses it. That is, only if we forget that there are two persons there and think of the pregnant woman as a mere receptacle for the incubation and delivery of the new human, can we deny her the right of self-defense that we would grant to anyone else. Thomson thinks this shows that the extreme view of abortion, in which abortion is impermissible even when required to save the mother's life, is false. In the next step, she takes the house metaphor forward in order to question the claim that the third party couldn't choose between the mother and the child, saying, the mother and the unborn child are not like two tenants in a small house which has, by an unfortunate mistake, been rented to both. The mother owns the house. Just because another person could save himself by using something that you own doesn't give him a right to it. She offers another thought experiment to help make that clear. If Jones has found and fastened on a certain coat, which he needs to keep him from freezing, but which Smith also needs to keep him from freezing, then it is not impartiality that says, I cannot choose between you when Smith owns the coat. Women have said again and again, this body is my body, and they have reason to feel angry, reason to feel that it has been like shouting into the wind. Smith, after all, is hardly likely to bless us if we say to him, of course it's your coat, anybody would grant that it is, but no one may choose between you and Jones who is to have it. She thinks it follows from this consideration that it is permissible for a third party to intervene in the mother's interests against the fetus. This applies to doctors and others capable of performing abortions. So far, Thomson's discussion has been about cases in which the mother's life is at stake, which are rare today given advances in medical technology. She then turns in the paper to the vastly more common cases in which a woman wants an abortion for some less weighty reason than preserving her own life. This involves bringing into question what the right to life of the fetus consists in. She suggests it requires at least a right to be given the bare minimum necessary for continued life. But again, a fanciful thought experiment shows that this cannot be right. Even if Thomson will die unless some particular celebrity comes to her deathbed to lay his hand on her brow, she has no right to him coming, and her friends have no right to go and kidnap him to make him do it. It might be kind of him to do it if he so chooses, but Thomson would not have a right to it. By analogy, it might be kind of the mother to allow the fetus to keep taking what it needs from her to continue living, but the fetus does not have a right to it. Still, it's important to acknowledge that to stop the fetus from doing this, one would have to kill it. And remember, we are supposing that it is a person. The argument we started with simply asserted that the fetus has a right to life and so may not be killed. Thomson suggests this was not careful enough. If the right to life involves being given the bare minimum necessary to continue life, and the fetus has no right to that, then the mother may refuse to give that without wronging the fetus. We need to talk not about killing per se, but about unjust killing, which is killing without sufficient moral justification. Thomson explores the possibility that if a voluntary act led to pregnancy, then killing may lack justification. This would mean, for example, that abortion after rape was permissible because the pregnancy was involuntary, which again undercuts the exceptionless anti-abortion arguments. But abortion in other circumstances would not be. Even with this concession, there's a big difference between voluntary in the sense of trying to get pregnant and voluntary in the sense of taking all possible precautions against getting pregnant and still ending up pregnant. Thomson thinks that at most these considerations establish that there are some cases in which the fetus has a right to the use of the mother's body, and so some cases in which abortion would be unjust killing. The paper ends with a discussion of what we are required to do for other people in need, what our Good Samaritan duties are. Thomson argues that even though we'll generally think it's good to help people in need when we can do so at low cost, it is not morally required of anyone that he give long stretches of his life, 9 years or 9 months, to sustaining the life of a person that has no special right to demand it. But 9 months would be a long stretch of life, and this is what the anti-abortionists think the mother owes the fetus. 9 months in the case she carries to term and then adopts the baby out, and 9 years standing in for the period of dependency in the case she keeps the child and raises it. Thomson points to a case in which 30 bystanders watched a woman be murdered and did nothing, not even phone the police. And this was not illegal. She says it's striking that, in parallel, in most states in this country, by which she meant America, women are compelled by law to be not merely minimally decent Samaritans, who might at least phone the police, but good Samaritans, who would generally take on a lot more cost to help someone, to unborn persons inside them. We can reflect on what these discrepancies in the law and in social attitudes reveal about attitudes to women at the time, and in some places still today, perhaps reflecting gender norms about what women are for example, to be mothers, or should be like, for example, selfless, caring, self-effacing. As we talked about in Lecture 5, if women are socially constructed as caregivers, then it starts to make a lot more sense that good Samaritanism from a pregnant woman to her fetus is expected and not merely appreciated when given. Thomson's account does not produce the verdict that abortion is always acceptable, nor that it is always unacceptable, and she counts this in its favour. She thinks it supports that the sick and desperately frightened 14-year-old schoolgirl pregnant due to rape may of course choose abortion, and that it would be indecent in the woman to request an abortion if she is in her 7th month and wants the abortion just to avoid the nuisance of postponing a trip abroad. The rights conflict approach is useful because it grants what was at the time the contested assumption that fetuses were persons and makes the case for the sometime permissibility of abortion on other grounds. And because once we think in terms of rights conflicts, we can draw on familiar ways of thinking about these and settling them in order to help resolve some of the more intractable issues. Part 2. When does a human being begin? Assume a secular worldview in which there are no souls. Suppose that two people who share this worldview nonetheless disagree about the permissibility of abortion. One very common idea that gets invoked in such disagreements is that of future personhood, where if left alone, the fetus will be a person in the future. But suppose we're dissatisfied with that, because we want to know whether it would be wrong to abort the fetus now, before it is a person, in which case we can't rely on claims about what it is wrong to do to persons. One way to try to make progress on the disagreement is to think about when the person begins. so that we know at what point in a pregnancy there is a person and therefore a potential conflict of rights, and when there is not. In their 2003 paper, 16 Days, Smith and Berit Brogaard ask a more precise version of this question. When does a human being begin to exist? This is helpful in that it avoids the conceptual slipperiness of person, but it may also be unhelpful if parties to the debate insist that human being and person are too different for the conclusions to be relevant. Smith and Brogaard want to know whether there is a moment of coming into existence that parallels the moment of going out of existence, namely death. We tend to speak colloquially as though that moment is birth, and we pair birth and death as the start and end of human life. Birth is certainly one answer to the question, and we'll talk more about it in part 3 in thinking about the relationship between the mother and the fetus. But it's not the only possible answer, and it's actually a pretty implausible answer once we consider all the options. Their approach is to look for moments from conception to birth where it is plausible to say that something new begins to exist, and to say that that thing is plausibly a human being, the same human being that exists after birth. It might be that something begins to exist at conception, but it isn't a human being. If the objection to abortion is that it's the killing of a human being, then there will be no objection to abortion at this stage. There's a lot of science in answering this question, but that's what's great about it. There are facts of the matter, and facts are easier to settle than values. Word of warning, for the next few minutes, it's going to seem like I'm being extremely annoying, telling you about something completely not related to feminism, namely Aristotelian substance metaphysics, but bear with me because it actually will be useful for the rest of the lecture. The ancient Greeks gave us the concept of a substance, which is roughly equivalent to object or individual, but individual thing rather than individual person. We need this to think about what there is along the pathway from conception to birth. First, whether there is a substance, and second, whether that substance is plausibly a human being. So here are some things about substances. A substance is something that takes up space, and when it exists as a whole. Think of things like rocks and trees and tables and cats and robots. If there is a cat, the cat takes up space. You can point to where it is and to how much space it's taking up. And if there is a cat, there's a whole cat, not one part of a cat here and the other part over there, at least if it's alive. There could, on the other hand, be the whole cat here and something that was previously a part of the cat over there, for example, if its tail gets chopped off. Here are some other things about substances. They can undergo changes. The cat lying in the sun is warm. It moves to the shade and becomes cool. They remain the same substance numerically or cease to exist. The cat will only ever be that cat or dead. It will not become a dog. They can survive some change in spatial parts. The cat remains a cat after losing its tail or after gaining a prosthetic limb. They, and this one's going to be very important, have a complete external boundary that separates them from other substances. Think of, for example, a fish swimming in an aquarium. The fish's skin is a complete external boundary and is what separates it from other fish. Two notes here, because obviously by this point you are thoroughly enjoying substance metaphysics. Smith and Brogaard comment that in this respect of having an external boundary, human beings are more like tubes than spheres because we have external boundaries on the inside too. When a man swallows his wedding ring, the ring is in him, but it is still external to him. It is not a part of him. And it also follows from this condition that Siamese twins are one, not two. Or in other words, because each twin is not separated from the other, each is not a substance. Next thing about substances, they are internally connected, meaning there are no gaps between parts. So the drummer and the guitarist in a band are not connected, there are gaps between them. So the band is not a substance, but the drummer and the guitarist are each substances. And finally, substances are independent. They do not depend on other entities to bear or carry them. Compare this with, for example, smiles or blushes or headaches. None of these things are substances because none of these things are independent. Okay, now we're in a position to know when some stage in the development from conception to birth is a substance, and we need to know about organisms so that we can say when that stage is both a substance and an organism, or perhaps more clearly, is the substance human being. Planets and footballs and boxes of bricks and aquariums are substances, but they are not organisms. To get to organisms, Smith and Brogaard say, we need to introduce the concept of a unified causal system that is relatively isolated from its surroundings. Here are the further conditions: a full exterior covering or membrane, a specific internal climate with ranges that cannot be exceeded. The exterior membrane protects against disruptions to the internal climate, and mechanisms to regulate their own internal climate. They write, we take it as unproblematic that there is a chain of events starting with the movement of the sperm towards the egg and leading on in normal cases through birth and on still further through the acquisition of self-awareness. We also take it as unproblematic that this chain of events in its earliest phases does not yet involve a human being, and in its later phases does involve a human being, which then preserves its identity through time. This proposition is so strongly supported by our ordinary pre-philosophical intuitions that one would need extraordinary arguments in order to refute it. And this sets up the question of when the human being begins to exist. For if there isn't a human being at the very start of this chain of events, and there is one by the point of the acquisition of self-awareness, then there must be a point at which the human being begins. We've learned that one substance does not become another. A substance remains the same numerically or ceases to exist. So we need to look for the right kind of change along the process of development that would count as a new substance coming into existence. And in our case, an organism, and a human organism in particular. From their recounting of the timeline of development, Smith and Brogaard extract 14 possible points of significant change, at any of which we might say that there comes into existence a substance that is also a unified causal system. They are A, the stage of the single cell zygote, which is day 0. B, the stage of the multi-cell zygote, days 0 to 3. C, the stage of the morula, day 3. D, the stage of the early blastocyst, day 4. E, implantation, days 6 to 13. F, gastrulation, days 14 to 16. G, onset of neurulation from day 16. H, formation of the brainstem, days 40 to 43. I, end of first trimester, day 98. J, viability, around day 130. K, sentience, around day 140. L, quickening, around day 150. M, birth, day 266. And N, the development of self-consciousness, sometime after birth. If you want the precise details, you'll need to look at the paper, but in brief, their strategy is to rule out some of the later candidates on the grounds that there is a satisfactory earlier candidate. Given that we're looking for the beginning of the human being, we'll want the earliest convincing candidate. And rule out some of the earlier candidates on the grounds that they are either not substances or not relatively isolated causal systems, or not plausibly continuous with, in the sense of not being the same entity as, the later human being. They rule out A because the zygote will undergo fission, B because this thing is not one thing but many things, and furthermore they have no causal unity. They rule out C, D, and E because none are causally isolated systems, in particular because they fail to have mechanisms to restore stability, explained above as mechanisms to regulate internal climate, as organisms must have. And that's how we end up at F, gastrulation, and the title of their paper, 16 days, which is the point at which gastrulation is complete and neurulation is about to begin. They explain that gastrulation is the point at which differentiation occurs. Gastrulation begins with a massive migration of cells to the center of the embryo. Part of the mass of cells folds to create a hollow, and then the sides around this hollow close together to form a genuine cavity. Through this topological process of folding and connecting, there arise within the embryo 3 distinct types of site, occupied respectively by outward and inward facing cells and by cells between these two. This in turn allows for a differentiation into types of cells specialized for the production of specific forms of protein. Cells within the ectoderm, or outer tube of the embryo, are predestined to form the skin, hair, nails, the lens of the eye, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, the mouth, and nervous tissue. Cells within the endoderm, the inner tube of the embryo, will go on to form the tonsils, larynx, trachea, lungs, and the linings of the alimentary tract. Cells within the mesoderm, or intervening layer, will become the muscle and connective tissue, blood cells, bone marrow, skeleton, and reproductive organs. It is at this point that we generally start talking about the embryo. This is a significant point of change where there ceases to be a cluster of homogeneous cells and starts to be a single heterogeneous entity, a whole multicellular individual living being. Their conclusion, it is gastrulation which constitutes the threshold event for the beginning to exist of the human individual. As a result of some later discussion of technicalities, they add 2 further conditions to what we have already for substances and organisms to get us to human beings, organisms that are human. These are A, they are non-divisible, and B, they are maximal. If some other whole has them as a part, that is only when that whole also has a niche as a part, inside which they reside, like the man who swallowed his wedding ring. This second requirement takes us to part 3. The paper we'll be looking at there draws heavily on Smith and Brogaard's discussion, but disagrees with them about the relation between fetus and mother. Smith and Brogaard see the moment where the pregnant woman gives birth and the baby emerges into the world not as a change in what exists, but merely being a transition of a thing that already exists from one environment to another. Because the human being begins at gastrulation, it thereafter lives in the pregnant woman. Smith and Brogaard see pregnant women as niches, spaces that the new organism can occupy or be a tenant of, but can ultimately move in or out of. In part 1, we saw Judith Jarvis Thomson using the metaphor of a house to talk about pregnancy, which captures this same idea. If Smith and Brogaard are right, then fetuses are not parts of pregnant women, but organisms in their own right that just happen to be housed in or by pregnant women. Smith and Brogaard themselves disavow any direct implications of their view of when the human being begins for the abortion debate. In the introduction to their article, they write, "What follows is an exercise in ontology, ontology being a subdiscipline of metaphysics concerned with what exists. And clearly, no conclusions of an ethical sort can be drawn directly from the answer to any ontological question. Lest the reader thinks that it is possible to draw such conclusions from our answer to the question as to when a human being begins to exist, we note 1. That there are many situations in which it is justified to kill a human being, self-defense is one such case, and also 2. That establishing when a human being begins to exist does not in and of itself establish when rights or other morally relevant attributes can begin to be assigned to that being. Thus, it may be that a post-16 days organism is a human being and has rights, but Judith Jarvis Thomson is right that there is a rights conflict that in many cases the mother wins. Or it may be that the post-16 days organism is a human being but doesn't have rights yet, or only has a limited set of rights compared to a child or an adult. Smith and Brogaard do say that they expect an answer to the question of when human beings begin to exist to be of some help in settling issues to do with abortion and stem cell research, but they don't say more about exactly the contribution it is supposed to make. I take their view as tipping us toward the conflict of rights framing, because I find it most natural to think that when there is a human being, there are also human rights. That would mean that any time after 16 days, there are 2 persons and 2 sets of rights. And note that 16 days is a lot earlier than most states that allow abortion put the cutoff, meaning Smith and Brogaard's view supports the pro-lifers' view that there is a lot of killing of human beings going on. Part 3. What is the relation between the pregnant woman and her fetus? In her 2018 paper, Lady Parts, The Metaphysics of Pregnancy, Elselijn Kingma is interested in the question of what the metaphysical relationship is between a pregnant woman and her fetus. She considers the view that the fetus is a part of the pregnant woman, like an organ is, hence the title of the paper, Lady Parts. This is what is known in philosophy as a mereological relationship. Mereology is the study of the relation between parts and wholes. But if the fetus is a part of the pregnant woman, then we need a story about when the fetus ceases to be a part and starts to be a whole. That would be when there is a person. Or alternatively, we need the claim that organisms we think of as wholes can also be parts of other organisms, which is a bit weird of a claim. Kingma notes that a lot of the prior discussion about the coming into existence of a human focuses on the fetus alone, along various stages of its developmental pathway. We've just considered one example of such a discussion. But that approach, she says, loses sight of something significant. The coming into existence of humans and other mammals does not happen in a vacuum, but occurs in what, for now, we shall call intimate intertwinement with another organism, the maternal organism. The reasons Smith and Brogaard gave for thinking that the pregnant woman is a niche and the fetus something that occupies that niche for a time are that niches and occupants do not overlap or have parts in common, don't share an external boundary, and must be separated from each other by some liquid or fluid-filled cavity. The example Kingma gives to illustrate these three conditions is a fish in an aquarium. There is a cavity in the aquarium filled with water, and the fish is in that. The boundary of the aquarium is different, it's much bigger than the boundary of the fish. And the fish and the aquarium don't share parts. So the fish is inside the aquarium, not part of the aquarium. Other examples in Smith and Brogaard's paper that I didn't mention in part 2 are an astronaut in a spaceship and a tub of yogurt in a refrigerator. Similarly, the fetus inside the pregnant woman has its own external boundary and exists in a fluid-filled cavity. This looks like support for the claim that Smith and Brogaard are right. But Kingma disagrees with them about the boundary claim. She gives 3 ways of thinking about the boundary of the fetus. 1, it has the same boundary that the future baby will have, namely it ends at the umbilical cord. 2, as just described, plus umbilical cord and placenta, the organ which forms in the wall of the uterus and from which the fetus grows. Or 3, as described in the last 2, plus the amniotic and choriotic membranes. The former develop in the fetus side of the placenta, the latter on the pregnant woman's side. But Kingma says that all of these are arbitrary boundaries, like declaring certain areas of a city postcodes for the purposes of mail delivery, which obviously don't carve the city at its joints. The future baby boundary is the most obviously arbitrary. During the pregnancy, the umbilical cord is attached, and there is no clear boundary along it that divides the baby from the pregnant woman. But much the same can be said of the future baby plus placenta. Later, the baby will be born, and the umbilical cord will be cut, severing the connection to the placenta, and the placenta will come out. And so there will be clear boundaries between the woman, the baby, and the placenta. But those boundaries are arbitrary during the pregnancy, where it's all part of one system. The placenta is not even a distinct organ. It is very much intertwined with other things around it, like arteries and veins. And the same goes for the final option too, including the membranes. So all of these candidate boundaries are arbitrary, not real. And because of that, the fetus and pregnant woman do in fact share overlapping parts. For example, the umbilical cord, the placenta. They do share an external boundary, the inner boundary for the woman, the outer boundary for the fetus, and the fetus is not completely separated by some fluid-filled cavity, unlike the fish in the aquarium. Other things that are only partially in such cavities but otherwise connected, we think of as clearly parts, like hearts, lung, kidney, brain, pancreas, intestines. So the conditions for niche-tenant relation are not met. Kingma's conclusion: on none of the plausible conceptions of the boundary of the fetus does the fetus stand in a tenant niche relation to the pregnant woman. As you'll see, I'm substituting some of her terminology to keep things simpler. If Kingma is right, then Smith and Brogaard's argument against the fetus being part of the pregnant woman fails. And so we're back at being able to think of the fetus as a part, which is what Kingma thinks. But thinking about the fetus as a part, where the pregnant woman is the whole, creates an interesting dilemma for the question of when an organism comes into existence. Where Smith and Brogaard were working to determine the moment of existence in the earliest stages from conception, settling at 16 days, one of Kingma's answers is a lot later, namely birth. So, two options. Option 1, birth. Because we generally think that organisms of the same kind are distinct, so we'll think about separate mice or cats or dogs, then we'll have to think that while two things are not distinct, as the fetus is not distinct from the pregnant woman, one is not an organism. This pushes us to saying that the human organism becomes an organism at birth, which is the point at which it fully separates from its mother. So the 16 days claim made by Smith and Brogaard is false. Existence starts much later than that. This view is attractive, says Kingma, because it ties existence to a specific event, birth, avoiding vagueness problems along the developmental pathway, and it is intuitive because it makes organisms things that are clearly distinct and separate from each other. It also increases the status of birth, which is not merely a change of environment, as Smith and Brogaard thought, but in fact a substantial change in what exists, where we go from no organism to organism. One problem with this option, which relates to our discussion of substance metaphysics in part 2, is that the fetus doesn't survive birth. There is one thing, the fetus, that ceases to exist, and another thing, the baby, that begins to exist, rather than, as Smith and Brogaard saw it, the same thing that merely changes environment. It seems extravagant to say that cutting an umbilical cord creates a human being. Another problem is that we want to say that babies were fetuses, and we can't say that on this view. Parents who look at scans of the fetus in utero and think of it as the first picture of their baby are wrong, and this is pretty unintuitive. Option 2 is to accept the idea of wholes with parts that are themselves wholes. So given these problems with the existence begins at birth option, we might instead want to go for an alternative and deny that organisms come into existence at birth, and say instead that organisms can be parts of other organisms after all. Then at least we can talk about the fetus/baby as continuous and as persisting in its existence through birth. So what are the problems with this view? One is that it doesn't meet the conditions we talked about earlier for how to think about substances and organisms, so that we could only choose this option at the price of revising those conditions, which are independently plausible. Another is that it creates counting problems, namely problems in saying how many things there are. When there is a pregnant woman, is there one organism or two organisms? Another is that it's not clear that the fetus is distinctive compared to things that are parts of the gestational mother, like organs. If we revise the conditions for substances and organisms to make it possible that the fetus is both an organism in its own right and part of the pregnant woman, those revisions then let in things other than fetuses as being organisms too. But we don't tend to think of a kidney or any other organ as an organism, or perhaps even as a whole in its own right. Once we factor in the theoretical cost of counting a whole bunch of other stuff as an organism, it's not clear that this is an appealing direction to go in just for the benefit of avoiding the claim that existence begins at birth. Yet another problem is, what are the spatial and temporal boundaries of the fetus as a whole? We already looked at 3 candidates for trying to give a clear boundary for the fetus as distinct from the pregnant woman and found them all arbitrary. Kingma says it's even worse once we've weakened all the conditions to allow for fetuses to be both organisms and parts of other organisms. Which parts of each overlap? And when do fetuses come into existence on this new view? It might be much earlier than Smith and Brogaard's 16 days if we're just considering when that part of the mother began to exist, perhaps only a few days after conception. There might also be serious moral issues with thinking about individuals in terms of rights. For example, rights to bodily autonomy, privacy, and non-interference, all of which presume distinctness or separateness. The problem of organ donation might then become as morally serious as the problem of abortion. The problems for this option may be even worse than those facing the first option. In sum, Kingma thinks the part-whole view of the fetus/pregnant woman is correct, and that just knowing more about the physiology of pregnancy, that there is not a clear external boundary, supports it. But if it is, then we have to choose between two views, both of which come with unintuitive implications. She says, either we retain an intuitive, clear, and non-messy view of what mammalian organisms are, clearly delineated, physically separate, relatively independent individuals, but such organisms can only begin at birth, which comes at a cost. It means giving up on the idea that fetuses and babies could ever be one and the same persisting organism or thing. Alternatively, we can hold on to the intuitive idea that organisms exist prior to and survive their birth. But then we would have to give up on what now seems one of mammals' central characteristics, their separateness. We would have to accept that it is a regular part of the mammalian, that is human, life cycle that mammals are part of other mammals. Such a change to our conception of the organism may have significant knock-on effects. Like Smith and Brogaard, Kingma is keen to insist that there are no straightforward ethical implications of her view. She writes, I also invite the reader to remind themselves that a metaphysical claim about organisms does not in itself license moral conclusions, or indeed claims about persons in the absence of significant further moral or metaphysical assumptions that require independent defense. Then later, in discussing the drawbacks of the view that organisms come into existence at birth, she notes that this would mean fetuses are not organisms, and she says, some may be tempted to draw quick moral conclusions from this finding, but I repeat my earlier caution about moral inferences from metaphysical premises. This only seems a drawback if, for example, one believes all of our moral attitudes toward fetuses must depend on their being organisms, or if one believes that all parts of our body must be morally similar. Both beliefs need defense. She says maybe it'll turn out that our moral attitudes do or should track organisms and fetuses, or maybe it'll turn out that fetuses as parts of pregnant women's bodies demand different moral attitudes to, for example, her kidneys or her hair. Despite her own cautions, two strong conclusions about the permissibility of abortion could be taken from her view that the fetus is part of the pregnant woman. These conclusions depend on whether we accept her option A, existence begins at birth, or option B, organisms can be parts of other organisms. We might say that if the human being comes into existence when the umbilical cord is cut post-birth, then abortion at any stage is permissible, just as disposal or donation of any body part not necessary to your continued life is permissible. Or that if human organisms can be parts of other human organisms, then abortion at no stage is permissible, because human beings have rights not to be killed. If the latter is right, then we're back at the part 1 arguments about rights conflicts and the magnitude of Good Samaritan expectations on women. We are halfway through the course now, and we're going to take a 1-week break before the next lecture. Let's call it semester break, YouTube semester break. We'll be resuming again with lecture 7 on Sunday, 5th of October. See you then.